Hello and welcome. I hope everybody's having a great OptivCon. My name is Joshua Platts, and I'm here to present to you Your Password Policy Sucks, and We Can Prove It. We're going to start this presentation by talking about some of the statistics that Optiv has gathered regarding perimeter compromises. We'll talk about some of the technical side on how attackers are leveraging modern resources in order to attack passwords. And then finally, we'll talk about recommendations or remediations for hardening your environment against password attacks. As I said, my name is Joshua Platts. I'm a principal security consultant at Optiv on the threat management team. My role primarily involves delivering advanced attack penetration services, such as attack surface management, the advanced threat simulation, and vulnerability identification as a service. I've been with Optiv for 5 years. However, I've been performing security testing for 12. Prior to that, I was a network and system administrator and also spent some time as a blue team security engineer. Which brings us to why are we here? Because the truth is, passwords are really, really easy. But the problem is that at Optiv, with the statistics that we've been gathering, we've kind of determined that a lot of people are still getting it wrong. You know, we may make recommendations to increase the length of your passwords or ensure that you have password rotation, but really that's just a portion of ensuring that your enterprise accounts are protected against password spraying and attacks. So really, we're going to address the different challenges that we have today. Passwords are a simple concept, but people are still getting it wrong. The other one is the average password policy isn't strong enough. And when we talk about this with clients, a lot of times it comes back to, well, where do your recommendations come from? In honesty, our recommendations come from real world attack scenarios, and where we're able to compromise systems and test where we're not able to compromise systems. And we look for the commonalities between those, and oftentimes a well-robust deployment of password security is really one of the reasons why we're not able to get in quite often. Clients will come back to us and they'll say, well, PCI says this and NIST says that, and that's great. But really, right now, PCI is saying that 7-character passwords are strong enough. 7 characters are not strong enough. NIST currently says in the 863-B that 8-character passwords are strong enough, that even 9-character passwords are easily cracked, regardless of the complexity that you implement in them. And then the third challenge and why we're here is that majority of the breaches, and we'll talk about some of these statistics here shortly, were caused by a weak password. You can also say that other security technologies such as MFA were missing, but if that password had been stronger in combination with maybe some other technologies, those breaches would not have occurred. So what we've done at Optiv is we've actually gathered and tracked results from a year's worth of our penetration testing. So we wanted to use this information to build some sort of statistical database where we could query it to determine, commonalities between our assessments. All the survey results were anonymized and then analyzed. And so this is a really, really good slide here, because if we were to look at the method of compromise 10 years ago versus what we're seeing today, we would see quite a bit of change in these statistics. What we can see here is that, 2/3 of the time that Optiv was able to gain access to a perimeter environment, it was due to a weak or default password, usually weak. To be honest, I tell people, and I'm happy that the statistic came out to be what I've been telling people, but 70% of the time that we're able to get into your environment, it's because we guess a password like summer 2020. The other main methods of compromise would be the web application and input validation flaws. So those are going to be your SQL injections and your command injections. Those were much more prevalent, back 10 years ago. We also have missing patches and file upload as other common methods for gaining access to environments. What's really important to show here is that, 2/3 of the time, the problem that we have can be addressed by something that we consider simple. And so one of the things that we did gather as well is what is the password policy that our clients currently had implemented. And so we saw that in 45% of cases, just about half the time that people were using an 8-character or less password. that is following compliance regulations. So we can't say you're necessarily out of compliance, but here at Optiv, we want to make sure that you're as secure as possible, not necessarily just compliant. The next category is interesting as well, because we do see that 40% of people have passwords 9 to 11 characters. So probably most of those are going to fall in the 10-character category. And at Optiv, we recommend password policies be 12 characters or more, including complexity, with a 90-day password rotation. And we only observed 15% of customers that were leveraging a 12-plus character password policy. And obviously, we can't really talk about just passwords. We need to talk about multi-factor. When we're talking about securing your perimeter environment, it's no longer an option on if you should get multi-factor authentication deployed, but you need to do it. And sorry to sound so abrasive about it, but whether we're able to guess a password or attackers are able to phish a password, really multi-factor has become the de facto standard for protecting environments. And then really going through, a sanitation of your perimeter to ensure that everything that you are presenting to the internet is behind either, a VPN portal with multi-factor or some sort of ADFS solution with multi-factor, just to make sure that you still don't have applications that can be authenticated to and bypass the multi-factor authentication. So next we'll talk about some password cracking evolution. This is an area of particular interest to myself because back in 2012, when the LinkedIn password breach happened, this was kind of a fundamental shift in the way that attackers were attacking passwords. And a lot of this has to do with the technologies that were coming up around that period of time and have continued to grow that allowed attackers to go ahead and shift what we used to do to new techniques that are much more effective. And so when we talk about what we used to do, maybe we have some testers from the past in here that remember some of this stuff, but generally we used a central processing unit inside of a laptop or inside of a desktop, and we'd run John the Ripper. And John the Ripper was a great tool. It's still out there. It kind of has been sunset a bit by some other solutions that are out there, but it was effective. It worked in its time and age. It still can work, don't get me wrong. It's just, like I said, there are better solutions out there. And then rainbow tables. And what rainbow tables were just essentially really large databases that contained passwords and their hash value. And that way you could do a lookup within that table to find the original password without having to do any sort of password guessing. Rainbow tables became largely ineffective after 8-character passwords just due to the exponential number of candidates and the limitations of hard disk space. But they were used quite a bit back in the days. And so now we talk about the new. And like I said, some new technologies came out around that 2010 area. And it was really just explosive time. And probably the number one thing that I remember going on around that time was the Bitcoin mining or the blockchain mining. And what these systems are really is just generally a whole bunch of graphics cards dumped into a system and utilized for a single purpose. And graphics cards are able to perform certain operations actually much faster than a CPU due to the number of cores that it has. Your average desktop may have 8 cores, whereas a GPU can have upwards of 3,000 to 4,000 cores. And so really that just changed how we do math on the computer. We're able to offload that math from the CPU onto the GPUs so that we could do this much quicker. The next thing that we saw was we started building dedicated servers, whether these were blockchain mining or they were just used by consulting organizations like Optiv. And what these are is these are enterprise, fully redundant servers with GPUs crammed inside with proper cooling and leveraged by organizations to do either for Optiv we did the password recovery, but other organizations may use it for AI or modeling or CAD bad, that sort of thing. Gaming desktops, you wouldn't really think that this would be in this category of big powerhouses, but it actually is. We do see that the average gaming GPU that you can buy is more effective at cracking passwords and doing that math than some of the GPUs, the enterprise level GPUs that cost 5-6 times more. And then one of the newest things that we've developed here at Optiv is our mobile password cracker. This is an isolated system because oftentimes, your password Active Directory database is one of the most secure things that you can have in your organization. And so what we can actually do is we can ship a mobile password cracker to a client site where the database is loaded onto the system after it arrives, so that you never need to send your passwords outside of your organization, and that system can be scrubbed before it leaves your site. So next, I kind of wanted to break up my presentation with a couple of demonstrations here. So this next video that we're going to be playing is actually leveraging a single system within Amazon. That system has 8 GPUs built into it. It costs $24 per hour to run. And we're going to go ahead and we're going to say, let's test the PCI password policy. If PCI says that I can have a password of 7 characters as long as it's complex, how secure is that? And throughout this demonstration, we'll be able to show you that. Okay, so what we've got here is I've generated some dummy passwords. As you can see, they're highly complex. I've generated passwords of 1 to 7 in length, as well as one that's 8 in length, so we know it won't crack. So we have 71 hashes in our file. We're going to use the tool Hashcat and set some of the command line options that we need to in order to straight attack any possible 1 to 7 character password on this Amazon system. And we'll get a couple of errors here, and that's totally normal. Just differences of the graphics cards that are being used and the software. But as we can see, it's ramping up really quick here, and we're about to see a bunch of things flash across the screen, and I'll call them out as they go. So that's all the 1 character passwords. That's all the 2. Here's all the 3 character passwords. Here's all the 4 character passwords. All the 5s are cracked. And all the 6s are cracked. And now we move into a little bit of a longer period of time here. We'll do a status update here in just a second once it gets going. And we see, 3 minutes this is going to take. And I've sped up the video here for that 3 minutes so that we don't need to spend all day just waiting for passwords to pop out. But as you can see, once it's sped up, we start cracking any possible 7-character password, regardless of how complex or strong you make it. And so when you look at the cost of actually running this, it's $24 an hour at 3 minutes. We're just talking less than $1 in order to crack any of the passwords. And so now that we've talked about the past of password cracking and the current, let's look at the future. And rather, I'd call this the near future because it's already possible. And so one of the great things about cloud is cloud allows us to have near unlimited resources, and that those resources directly scale linearly. And that means that if I double the number of systems I'm running, it reduces my effort that I have, or the time, by half. And what we've seen with Amazon is that there's a lot of new instance types coming online. And what they're doing is each new generation of GPU instances generally drop the cost of, renting that timeshare. And what I witnessed between April 2015 and April 2017 is a drop of 78%. So if you think about that, it used to cost 5 times more to crack a password in 2015 than it did in 2017. And a lot of this explosive growth and new instance types and new organizations setting up GPU data centers is because of artificial intelligence and machine learning. A lot of organizations are using that into driving models, and those models all leverage GPUs. So the explosive growth in that industry has actually assisted and provided options for us in this industry. And so, as I said, it's no longer necessarily how long it takes to crack a password, but how much does it cost? Because when we look at brute forcing a password, and we'll talk about brute forcing in just a few moments here when we talk about the different types of attacks. But when we talk about brute forcing a password, at some point, it no longer becomes economically viable or possible for you to crack that password. There are other means and other attacks that can be launched, but as far as a brute force attack goes, you're really restricted by the fact that for every character that you add to your password length, you're making it more and more exponential. And so what we can see in this table here is that for passwords up to 7 in length, to crack anything from 1 to 7 would cost 85 cents. Now, these results are skewed a little bit because it does take time for an Amazon system to spin up and actually get the software installed. But when we're talking about, a couple minutes spent getting that spun up, it's only 85 cents of actual time running in order to crack the password. So then we start looking at longer passwords and determining, what is the threat model? Who are your attackers that are coming after you? Are they kids in the basement? Are they competitors? Are they nation states? So you really have to understand your attacker, their motives, and their financial predisposition to know where you would fall in this model. But we can see that 8-character passwords, we can crack those rapidly and for $80. 9-character passwords, we can crack for $7,500. And so you see the column there where it says duration in hours, and you're like, okay, yeah, well, it's still going to take you over 10 days to crack a 9-character password. But if you remember from the previous slide, the cloud is scalable. And so if we just launch more and more instances in a distributed environment, that we're going to be able to recover the passwords much quicker at the same cost. That's the whole point of this table, is to show you that the cost isn't going to change regardless of how long you spend trying to do the password cracking. And as you can see, once you get into the 10, 11, and 12-character password lengths, it becomes pretty much economically infeasible that someone's going to pay that in order to attack your institution. Maybe you'll have someone that will spend $720,000 to recover a password in your organization, but it's highly unlikely someone's going to pay $68 million. And like I said, at Optiv, we recommend a 12-character password. One of the big reasons why we recommend that is because while there are other attacks and we can't control the way our users select our passwords, we know for a fact that a 12-character password is going to cost in the figures of $6 trillion to crack via a brute force attack. So just by implementing this policy, you're starting to limit the techniques that attackers can use to actually attack your passwords. And so now we'll talk about some of the advanced research that I've been doing, and it's exactly that. How high can we scale in a cloud environment? How many systems can we join together in a distributed workload? And what type of performance can we achieve in attacking those passwords and demonstrating that, even that 9-character password for $7,500 isn't secure. And so what I've done is I've built a cloud-based distributed system that contains 320 GPUs, 2,560 CPUs, 8 terabytes of RAM, and a terabyte of video RAM. In this presentation, we'll see that as we go ahead and attack the 9-character password space. Okay, so in this video, we're using Hashtopolis. We're configuring it right now with a voucher, which is essentially a password for the agents that will be joining, and configuring that to allow it to be used more than once. What we're going to do next is we're going to build a simple password of 9 characters in length that we can use as a target. We'll create a new hash list within Hashtopolis. And a little bit about Hashtopolis is it's a great distributed platform for distributing the password cracking workload out between many agents. And as you can see, we don't have any agents, so we'll go ahead and we'll create some in Amazon. As you can see, I have a Bootstrap script that I'll use when launching these instances that will pre-configure them to automatically join my Hashtopolis server. I'm going to use the CUDA AMI within Amazon, along with the GPU instance P3 16X large, which comes with 8 GPUs. I'll request 20 of these, which is a high number, and you have to get special approval with Amazon to be able to do this. And then down here is where I'll put that Bootstrap script. At this point, I don't need to make any further changes to the system, so I'll go ahead and create it. And so what I've done is I've created 20 systems in one availability zone. And I'm actually going to go back through and do this one and fast forward a little bit, where we're going to create another 20 instances in a different availability zone, so that instead of just having 20 systems with 160 GPUs that we actually have, as we can see, 40 systems with 320 GPUs. So we wait for all those to come online, and some of this video has been edited to make it quicker. And now those systems are coming online and they are connecting directly into Hashtopolis. So as we can see, we were 36, almost there. We got all 40. Next, what I do is I do some database updates, because otherwise I'd have to go to all 40 agents and make some configuration changes. So, you know, I set some predefined variables to all the systems at once. And now it's time to create a new task to actually recover these passwords. So in this attack, we'll be doing a mask attack, which we'll talk about it a little bit here in the video, in the presentation. But as we configure this, we now have the task created. If we refresh, we'll be able to see agents are automatically taking that up. We can turn on the auto refresh. And we'll go ahead and wait. Again, this has been sped up slightly because this does take time. What it's doing is it's doing benchmarks on systems to determine how much work they can take at a time. And now we can see it's starting to ramp up. We're already at 9.5. Oh, we're at 22 trillion guesses per second. So we actually are cracking so fast that we broke the software. It doesn't know what a terahash is. So we're at 22.5 terahashes with all the different agents that we have here. As we can see, they're all performing pretty much similar. And then finally, if we look at that estimated time remaining at the top, every update we can see that it's shrinking by more than the time spent is going up. And that's just, it's recomputing how long this is going to take. And we can see that that will average out at about 7.5 hours. So let's talk a little bit more about the hacker techniques. We've already talked a little bit about a brute force. So we'll go ahead and we'll talk through these in just a couple slides so that we're all speaking the same language, and we can go from there. So the first attack of note would be a word list attack. So what a word list attack is, it's just taking a giant list of words. So in this example for this slide, we're saying the word summer. What we do with those word lists is that we actually use a tool called Hashcat, and we couple those words with rule transformation. What a rule transformation basically is it says, take the word summer and capitalize it. Okay, take the word summer, capitalize it, and put the year at the end. Or, okay, take the word summer and replace the S with a $sign. And so what we're actually trying to do with these rules is not only just define common passwords such as capitalized or not capitalized, but start to look at some of those transformations that people actually put into their passwords to try to make them more secure. You know, reversing a password, typing a password twice. All these types of rules, once we know how users select their password, we write a rule to attack that type of password. And really the key to success here is having a good word list and a good rule list. There are word lists and rule lists out there that you can download and actually run yourself. However, a curated word list or a curated rule list will be much, much more effective. So next, we can talk about brute force attacks. When a brute force attack is really just an attack that exhausts all the possibilities of a password up to a certain length. And so we know that there's only so many uppercase letters, lowercase letters, digits, and special characters on a keyboard. If we add all of those up together, we ended up with 95. And so what we can say is, now that we know we have a fixed amount of possibilities for a password letter, we can start to look at the length and start doing incremental attacks to go from there. Leveraging that one system that I demonstrated that ran for $24 an hour during the PCI demo video, we were able to crack all the 1 to 7 character passwords in 2 or 3 minutes. And then we're also able to do 8 character passwords in just over 3 hours. But as I've demonstrated in the distributed video, if we threw more resources at it, that we could actually bring that time down. Finally, the last and probably my favorite type of attack, and these aren't a comprehensive list of attacks that are utilized, but these are the main ones, would be a mask attack. So what a mask attack is when we take a password and we translate it into its character type. So for instance, if the password starts with a capital S, the password mask would be U. And then if it's followed by 5 lowercase letters, it's going to be U followed by 5 L's for lowercase. If it's followed by 4 digits, we're going to add on 4 D's. Then if it's followed by a special character, we would add on an S. So as you can see in the middle there, we have the summer 2019. So that's an 11-character password. And the brute force 11-character passwords, we already determined is impractical. However, if we say, I don't want to brute force all 95 possibilities in every spot of the password, but I only want to look at the 26 uppercases, followed by 5 of the 26 lowercases, followed by 4 digits, followed by a special character, we can get much, much higher results for performing brute force attacks. And what we've already identified is that, while brute forcing 12 characters is never going to be possible, if you get really honed into a specific mask like this one, it would be practical to even attack up to 12 character passwords that follow a common format. And so this is probably the section that everybody's been waiting for. What can we do? You told us it's so easy. You've walked us through the stats. We're on board. We want to shore up our password security. So what are the recommendations that Optiv would have in order for me to do that? And to be honest, the first thing that starts with is reevaluating what your password policy is. At Optiv, anytime we do an assessment and we find passwords less than 12 characters or passwords that aren't complex, we will go ahead and we will write up a finding for that, letting them know that we recommend 12-character passwords. They should be complex. They should rotate either 90 or 120 days. And then we also do recommend using a fine-grained password policy for system administrators, requiring a minimum password length of 20 characters. In the event that you're running legacy systems in your environment that don't support passwords that long. We hear that a lot. There's a couple different options that you could do there. The first and foremost suggested one would be using dual authentication. For simplicity, a lot of people like to link Active Directory to everything. You have one login to rule them all. But in the event that you have a system that is hampering the ability to apply enterprise-wide security policies, it may make sense to have 2 different accounts. If it's your mainframe that's only allowing you to have 8-character passwords, have an 8-character mainframe password, and then have an Active Directory 12-character password. And if that doesn't work for you, the next thing we would recommend is or what we generally see people do is fine-grained password policies that will allow the users that use those systems, whether they're the mainframe users or whatnot, those users can have weaker passwords. We don't like that, right? We never want to say, hey, we're going to let something be weaker. But if in order to bring up 80% of the business and accounts to a strong password policy, if we have to kind of write off that, you know what, these people, they're still going to have 8-character passwords and you know, we're going to accept that risk, you know, that's still better than nothing. Password blacklisting, just like I said earlier, and I'll say again in a slide or two here, you know, multi-factor authentication is one of those things that's de facto standard now, so is password blacklisting. You know, when we look at the 66% of times that we were getting into perimeter environments, you know, those are times that we're guessing seasons and years and company names. You know, sometimes, you know, we don't get in that way, so what we'll do is we'll research the local area. What is your sports team? Have they won a Super Bowl? You know, what's your college town? So really, defining a blacklist of predictable words that could be used in your passwords is awesome. Because if you can make it harder for someone to just outright guess a password, you're really going to shore up that security of perimeter compromise. Password auditing. So this is, you know, essentially what we're doing when we're talking about attackers here in the previous slides, and we're running those Amazon instances. So we see clients that do this internal, or they may come out and they'll hire Optiv to do it. And what we'll do is we'll take a copy of the NTDDS from Active Directory and extract the password hashes from it. After that, at Optiv, we generally do a 7-day cracking period in which we go through a lot of the different attacks that we already talked about in this presentation, but also, you know, additional attacks that weren't discussed. And we'll go through and we'll crack as much as we can. At that point, we actually move into an analysis phase, because it's not as simple, we cracked your password or we didn't crack your password, but we go into an analysis phase. And this allows us to do things like help you build your initial blacklist. You don't know what you don't know. So running this audit once, whether internal or through a consulting firm, will allow you to, you know, build that first password list. Maybe you didn't think of putting the word accounting into your blacklist, even though you're an accounting firm. And doing these types of audits are the only way that you're actually going to get insight into how your users are selecting their passwords. The other thing people are using the password audits for is to, you know, kind of do a realization of success through their password policies that they're deploying, right? So when we sell these service offerings, what we're doing generally is we'll come in and we'll do an audit. We'll work with you in getting, you know, the password security shored up through remediation services, whether it's implementing a blacklisting tool or going through and finding other ways to secure the environment. And then we'll do the analysis, the password cracking again after everybody's had an opportunity to rotate their passwords. So at this point, we can kind of give a before and after snapshot of how effective the deployment of a stronger password policy was. And then additionally, one of the things that I've seen organizations do is they will constantly be running password cracking, you know, every day of the month. And if they recover a password, they will automatically set that user's password to reset upon next login. And the whole idea is, hey, if anybody can crack this password, let's just reset it, and hopefully brings people into selecting stronger passwords. And so multi-factor authentication, I said it before, I've said it twice now, that this is, you know, de facto standard now. If you don't have MFA and it's not on your roadmap, I strongly recommend that you review that, unless you don't have any sort of perimeter environment where you have people logging in for email or anything like that. And then you'll want to make sure that you put all non-MFA capable services behind an ADFS or VPN solution. One of the common pitfalls that we see with people that are deploying a brand new multi-factor authentication environment is that they allow self-registration, but they put it on the perimeter because they have workforce at home and they want the workforce at home to be able to self-register their own MFA token. Unfortunately, this opens up a huge gap that, as an assessor, I've taken advantage of several times, because if I'm able to guess, Sue and accounting's password of summer 2020, and I'm able to go to that website and add an additional authorized token for my phone, then I can log into the VPN or ADFS or what have you with a valid MFA push. And so, that's one type of bypass, and there are other types of bypasses for MFA out there. Some of them require compromising the host level system. Some of them require email phishing and that sort of thing. But even if it can be bypassed, even if there are weaknesses in it, maybe you deployed it for remote desktop, but you forgot to disable the SMB protocol, it is observed through our testing as one of the single most important things to do to secure your environment. And so password vaulting, we definitely would want to talk about password vaulting in this presentation. Password vaulting really is a good way to secure all passwords against password guessing attacks, right? So generally what you'll have is you'll have a system administrator has an account. They'll log into the password vaulting tool, say, hey, I want to access this system or access this privileged account. An audit log for privileged access is created. The password is issued to the user, and then shortly after, the user either checks back in the credentials or after a predefined period of time, that password is changed. So you have automatic instant password rotation, you have auditing and logging, and you prevented any sort of password guessing attacks. Generally, where we'll see this implemented is going to be on, your domain administrator type level accounts or anything that has really high privilege level in your environment. And then ensure that your system administrators are using non-privileged accounts in order, on their day-to-day activities. Far too often, we still see system administrators using their, workstation admin account to access their email. If you do password vaulting, put all the privileged accounts in there. Everybody else uses unprivileged accounts. The security of your environment will go up exponentially. And I've actually done password audits against organizations that had password vaulting in them. And generally, most password vaults will use something like a 32-character random password. And based on the information that we've identified today, we know that it's not possible to crack, brute force anything higher than 9 characters currently. 32 characters is out of this world. And so, when we did those audits, we didn't recover a single privileged account. So it's been proven effective. And we really need to talk about password selection, because the weakest link in any environment is going to be the human. We're all human. We all make mistakes. We all get lazy from time to time, reuse a password from here to there. And really, so comprehensive, reoccurring employee training is really, really important, because it's just like phishing, and you'll probably do the training together. But it's just like phishing. You need that person every time they click a link to think, should I click this link? What we need to do is we need to keep hammering password policies into people's heads to where they get to the point where every time they create a password, they're thinking, is this the password I should create? And so one of the ways that I've seen it when I was running Blue Team was it's really useful to educate users on how passwords are attacked. Wordless. Well, if you pick a word and you capitalize and you put a number at the end, that's a bad password. Well, what if my word is Mississippi? Well, that's even worse. That's a bad password. Or password masks. We're able to attack up to 12-character passwords if it's capitalized and ends with a year and an exclamation point. So by looking at those attacks, then we suggest that, you provide alternative ideas on strong password selection. And so a lot of people are like, well, what would you say here? And there's so many different ways that you can, again, it's kind of security through obscurity, but it actually is implementing security, is come up with your own techniques. I have a technique that my parents use. They're not super technical, but I found I found a method that works for them, that they have a unique password on every single site and they can remember it. And the reason why we can't simply just say, hey, these are all the techniques that you should use in your training is because if we already defined a technique, we're going to write a rule for that technique, and that's no longer really a viable technique. And humans will always find a way to choose bad passwords. And I mean, that's just the fact. You can always bring the number of recovered passwords in your organization down greatly by implementing a lot of these password policies, but you're never gonna prevent all passwords from ever being weak. And so that's where password auditing becomes more important, because then we can start to identify gaps in your training or blacklisting words that we initially didn't, to try to force the human element to have stronger passwords. All right, so that's everything that we have for this presentation today at OptivCon. I hope that I was able to bring you guys through some of the pitfalls to password security, technical implementation and password cracking, as well as remediation strategies to further strengthen each of your environments.